Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. Thank you, as always, for being prompt. From now on, all the talks will start right on time because it is important to reward correct behavior. Because all behavior, as we will talk about today, when we talk about the laws of learning, behaviors that are rewarded tend to increase in rate and magnitude in the future. So we would like to have that happen. Just a little bit about why I'm calling these the laws of learning. You know from previous talks that I have done that Allah has made certain laws of physics. For example, when I talked about the I don't know whether I have actually ever mentioned yet the four basic forces of physics. I mentioned some of them, but not all of them. They are basically the strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity. These are considered the four basic laws of physics. These are four ways that Allah manipulates matter at a very primal level. And we know a whole lot about these laws now. We don't know everything about them, but we know a whole lot. So the first laws, and then next we know about chemistry. And chemistry is like really complex physics. Chemistry is like the laws of physics applied to, as I was showing yesterday, to groups of atoms as opposed to individual atoms. So physics works on individual atoms. It also works on groups of atoms. But when it is working on groups of atoms alone, we call it chemistry. So we say we have the laws of chemistry. Then when chemistry gets really complex, it is still chemistry, but it gets so complex, we call it biology. So, and each one of these we know a little bit less. We know most about physics, a little bit less about chemistry, quite a bit less about biology. And all of these laws, although we call them laws and describe them as laws within the universe, they are all actually laws that Allah has applied to His universe to direct the physical existence to carry out His will. Or it is actually Allah directly carrying out His will, and we see His will being carried out. And because He does so in a lawful manner, we call it the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, and the laws of biology. But at each of these levels, it is to deal with different groupings of subatomic particles as they are moving into their more complex levels, to be able to direct them in the right way. So finally, we get to biological life, and Allah wants to direct biological life. So what Allah has done is He has set up a set of laws of learning for all biological life. And these same laws of learning do apply very, very well, or exactly the same, to human beings, except it is different with human beings because human beings have had the will of Allah breathed into them, so that, as I mentioned yesterday, they have Allah has taught them the names of things, or given us a symbolic language which allows us to have free will. So the same laws of learning apply to us, but to all of the lower biological life forms, they have to do exactly what they are told to do according to the laws of learning. Human beings get to choose whether or not to do what they want with the laws of learning. And these laws of learning are very, very powerful things. This is actually why, after all these years, I am still. And I had actually intended to work on this for another 20 or 30 years. So I was until recently in no hurry. You know, I thought I had been I thought I was very close, but I thought, well, another couple of years and I'll have the whole thing down perfect, and then start implementing. But a couple of years ago, I started implementing on a fairly small scale because I was so close, with the blessing of Allah, not because of any great talent on my part. And then I find out I don't have so long to live, and I get in a real hurry. So now I try to tell as many people as much as possible in hopes that, and I hope you realize this is why I'm doing these talks. It is not just because I'm interested in telling you about all of these different fields of science. I mean, if I wanted to do that, I would have been a university professor for the last 30 years or so. I'm telling you because I hope that you will be convinced enough by the logic and the science and the fact that this is consistent with our Islamic theology, that you will see what the potential of these ideas are to transform our ummah. And once you see that potential, and once you have that knowledge, you understand in Islam there is a different obligation upon you. Allah does not ask you to do anything you cannot do. So when you don't have this knowledge, when that knowledge was not written in your consciousness, and you did not know of the potential of it to transform the ummah, you have no obligation to do anything with it. But once you know about it, and if you do see the potential of it to transform the ummah, then you have an obligation to do something with it. So this is why I am telling people now. Anyway, I initially had planned to go into the physical sciences, and I was interested particularly in nuclear electronics. And at the time, there were only 2 places in the whole world that you could learn about. This was in the early 1960s. There were only 2 places in the whole world you could learn about nuclear electronics. One was in the US military, and one was in the Russian military. And because I lived in the US, I think it would have been very difficult for me to get into the Russian nuclear technology school. So I joined the US Navy nuclear submarine service and became a nuclear reactor technician, because this is the only place in the whole country where they teach you to do that. And I had planned to get out of the military and take a degree in nuclear engineering and do it because I was very interested in this field. But while I was in the military, 2 things happened. One, I came to a realization of the nature of military life, and which turns out to be totally insane. And actually, that's what really changed me. I was, I believe, still maybe 18, or maybe I had turned 19, I'm not really sure. When I was 18 when I went in, but when I had this interview, I might have been 19. To go into the particular field I was going to go into, I was going to be in the area of the submarine where the nuclear missiles are fired off. The United States desired to fire off nuclear missiles at other countries. And they want to be really, really sure, if the president issues orders to fire off these missiles, knowing that millions of people are going to be killed, that the people who are given these orders will do it. So you have to undergo a psychiatric interview to see whether you are fit to go into the program. And among the questions I was asked is if the order was given by the US president to fire off these missiles, and to fire them off not only toward the enemy, but because of circumstances in the security interests of the United States, perhaps toward so-called friendly nations, such as England and France was the example. Because they had a scenario where if Russia and the United States had traded a missile attack, but it had not affected Europe, Europe is over there right next to Russia. Russia could come in and take Europe and then be powerful again, and the United States had nowhere to take, so they would be weak, they would lose. So they had, one of their nuclear scenarios was called Operation Spoilsport, which the plan was to destroy destroy Western Europe, so the Russians could not take it if it would be an advantage. So they're asking here now, in the worst case scenario, would I be willing, since I was going to be in that area? The missiles are to be fired off by the officers. I was a non-commissioned officer, equivalent of a sergeant in the Army. So I wouldn't have the role of firing off the missile. It would be an actual officer who would have the role of firing off the missile. But I would be standing there wearing a .45 automatic on my hip. And if the officer who was supposed to fire off the missile froze, or for some reason refused to fire the missile for moral reasons or something, the question was, would I be willing to shoot him and then fire off the missile myself, knowing that I'm going to be killing millions of innocent women and children in so-called friendly countries? And if you say no, you don't go into the program. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this guy is a very high-ranking naval officer who's a psychiatrist who's asking me this. And I'm thinking to myself, you are just totally insane. This is just absolutely crazy to be asking an 18 or 19-year-old kid if they're willing to do this. But I already knew that if I said no, I don't go into the program. So I went ahead and said yes. But my thought was, if I was ever in that position, and the officer is going to press the button, well, actually they turn a key, but if an officer was going to fire off the missile and kill all these millions of people, I might pull out my gun and shoot him instead. There should be people there in that position. And then I spent several years out at sea in submarines. And these submarines are like maybe 300 feet or less long and about 26 feet wide. And they have maybe 125 people on them. And you learn a lot about human dynamics in a situation like this, a whole lot. So I got very interested in human behavior, and I got very interested in helping to bring about a world where people are not going to be killing each other in large numbers of millions with nuclear weapons, and then later on became involved in many social issues. So I had actually grown up somewhat brainwashed in America. Even the way I went into the military, I actually went down to join the Marines because they had all these signs around saying the Marines are looking for a few good men. And I thought, wow, it'd be nice to be within the class of good men, so I'll go down and join the Marines. Also, the Marines are the ones that go out and really do the fighting, and I was really quite an aggressive person at the time, and had been somewhat brainwashed about how wonderful America was and how everyone else was our enemy, and wanted to do something to help. And the Marine recruiter was out at the time, but the Navy one was there, and he came out and he said, "Are you waiting to see the Marine?" And I said, "Yes." He said, he won't be back for some time. Why don't you come in and see me? And told me about this nuclear program, thinking that I would have no chance to get in because you have to take all sorts of exams to get into it. And I hadn't done well in high school, so they thought I wouldn't do well on the exams, but they'll promise you anything to get your signature on the line. And then if you end up chipping paint out on a destroyer somewhere in the Atlantic, that's your business, because that's where your tests put you. But I did get into their electronics and their nuclear power schools, submarine school. But by the time I got out and the Vietnam War was, we were there as advisors in the Vietnam War. The war hadn't technically started yet. And I saw what was happening was that the United States was actually promoting and getting started a war in Vietnam. It was, the plan was, I mean, they even had us doing things like training people to make low-level explosives and things look like Viet Cong. They're South Vietnamese looking like Viet Cong, destroying South Vietnamese villages and property and infrastructure, making it look like they were being attacked by the communists when they weren't. They were being attacked by their own people that were being trained by the Americans. And I thought, this whole thing is just so crazy, and the dynamics of living that close with the people on the submarine got me very interested in psychology as a means. And so by the time I was probably about early 20s, I decided I wanted to devote my life to helping make the world a better place. Aside from the fact that I had grown up as a physically very abused child and wanted to help change the world so that kids in the future didn't grow up like that. So as soon as I got out of the military, I did two things. I actually got out a bit early so that I could, so that I wouldn't have to spend more time in Vietnam, and also so I could get into university. And as soon as I got out, I got very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And then decided for two reasons. One, I realized my math wasn't good enough, and two, I had become so interested in psychology that I thought psychology would be the means to help improve the world. But I thought at the time psychology was like Freud, and it was about these mentalistic ideas. Luckily, I ended up at a university where they had I think I mentioned before, a very advanced, or perhaps the most advanced at the time, theoretical physics laboratory. And so they paid me quite a bit of money as a student to work in the theoretical physics laboratory, and so I ended up going to that particular university. And that particular university had an orientation in psychology called technically operant learning theory, loosely called behaviorism, but if you call it behaviorism, you can get mixed up with the secular philosophy of behaviorism, which there was a big mix of the two. But it had the technical name for the laws of learning is operant learning theory. And this school was very heavily oriented toward operant learning, which was fairly new. That came from the laws of learning developed by probably the greatest psychologist of all time, B.F. Skinner, who I consider to be in psychology the equivalent to Einstein in physics. But he made the big breakthrough. He was the first one to actually see and formulate in like formula form the relationship between responses and the stimuli that followed them that controlled which direction those responses would go. So it was the only really scientific area of psychology. Now, at first I wasn't actually very thrilled about this because I had left the physical sciences thinking I was going into psychology, which was all these mentalistic ideas, and Freud, and psychoanalysis, and that. Then I end up in a school and I get a textbook and I open it up and it's got formula and things in it. So I think, oh, well, this is like science and physics. But I went ahead and learned it, and although I have to admit I thought it was kind of boring, until I took the next class in the sequence, which was on experimental psychology. And in the experimental psychology class, we were to when you first get in the class, they give you a live chicken. This live chicken is to be your experimental subject. And you are supposed to use these laws of learning that you have been taught in the first course and teach and design a fairly complex task for the chicken to learn. And teach that chicken to do this thing by the laws of learning. Now, I had never taught any animals anything. Certainly not, as a matter of fact, I'd never handled a live chicken before. So I thought, I want to really give this a good try, so I'm going to make quite a complex task for my chicken. And what I wanted my chicken to do was I wanted it to be somewhere where I can be sure I'm not going to fall over. I wanted to stand on its right leg only and hold its left leg up like this. Then I wanted to hop in a circle like this on one leg, on its right leg only, the whole time. I couldn't do it now, but holding its left leg up the whole time. And then on the wall of the cage there is a red button. And I want the chicken to peck that red button, push that red button, which will pop up a little food tray, and the chicken can have a bite of food. And then I wanted to do that again. And when it was standing like this, I wanted to turn the full circle to the right, not to the left. So, do you think that sounds like a fairly easy thing to teach a chicken to do? I think anyone who's driven down the road where there are chickens standing out in the road, no, chickens are not real smart. They will stand there, and if they are lucky, they will move at the last minute. And so, and you wouldn't think, by the way, a chicken brain is probably like about this big, and they don't act, they don't do a lot of very intelligent things, and they're not very often taught to do anything. So, say for instance you didn't know the laws of learning. What do you think your chances are of teaching a chicken to do that? Virtually none. I mean, you might try for a year and it's impossible. The question is, what in the world do you do? You have no clue in the world what to do. But it is like with many other things, before people came to understand the use of the lever, if there was a great big rock and they wanted to move it, it weighed 1,000 kilograms, they just can't move it. But once they learn about levers, it's fairly easy to move a 1,000 kilogram rock. You just have to have a long and strong enough pole and put the fulcrum in the right place, and one person can lift it. So it turns out the same thing is true with the laws of learning, that they are such a powerful tool that they allow you to do things that are otherwise impossible. And I would say, without knowing the laws of learning, that you could not teach a chicken to do that. This isn't to say that along the way, no one has ever taught animals to do all sorts of complex things. And they taught them by using the laws of learning, but they didn't know what the laws of learning were. They just knew techniques, but they didn't know that this was a lawful, that these were lawful relationships. So I get a cubicle with a little plastic box so I can see what the chicken's doing, and I put the chicken in the box, and it's just standing there. And now I'm going to apply these laws of learning that I have learned. And so you remember the task: stand on its right leg only, hold its left leg up, hop on its right leg only, a full circle to the right, press the button, a red button on the side of the cage, bend down, have a bite of food, and then do the same thing again. So the question is, where do I start? But before I tell you where I started and how it happened, I'm going to tell you this. The class was, they had a quarterly system there rather than a semester system. So a quarter was 12 weeks long. So a class was 12 weeks long. How long do you think it took me to teach the chicken to do that task? Do you think it took the whole 12 weeks?
So how long were you given? How long was the class given to teach the chicken?
There was 3 days a week for 12 weeks.
I see. So you're given the 12 weeks to get...
Well, if you needed the whole 12 weeks, you could have the whole 12 weeks. You just have to write up your experiment at the end. It took me less than 10 minutes to teach the chicken to do that. At which point I said to myself, wow, this is like a miracle. Then I had this thought cross my mind. If I can teach an animal as dumb as a chicken to do a task as complex as that in less than 10 minutes, why couldn't this same tool be used to raise children to be good and right human beings and create a good society? This is where this whole idea and everything I do now originated. I'll actually show you in a minute how I taught the chicken to do that. Because, and in the parenting book, or actually in the, for those of you who bought the third version of the Unified Theory, it is about the laws of learning, and there is a description in great detail in there. I think it's 10 or 20 pages long about teaching the chicken this, which illustrates really everything you need to know about learning. Not everything, but I mean everything to have a great success. So, the way learning works is you start with what is called the baseline condition. And you know, sometimes parents come and ask me, I have a child that's like this, how do I get them to be like that? It's a very common question. And my answer is, in a way, always the same, because there is only one process. I mean, the dynamics vary almost infinitely because of how complex human brains are and human thought systems. But the actual process itself, there is only one process. So you only have to learn one process to know how to do everything with learning. Then the trick is, to get good at it, is to learn how to alter that one process to get you the results you want in different situations. And here is the one process. You start with what's called the baseline condition, which is baseline. And all the baseline means is that's where things are at where you start. Right? So if you have a child that has tantrums, your baseline and has an average of 1 tantrum a day, that's the baseline condition with your child. And then you have up here you have a goal condition. So you have where you start, and where you start is just where you are. You don't have any choice in it, right? Doesn't matter whether you like where you start or you don't like where you start. That's just where you have to start. You start where things are. I started with my chicken just standing there in the cage like this. And and my goal was to have it stand on its right leg only, hop a full circle on its right leg, push a red button on the side of the cage, have a bite of food, and do it again. So I wanted to get from there to here. The name of the process of getting from here to there is called shaping. And essentially all learning is shaping. Matter of fact, every single characteristic you have, right? If you're good at math, you learn math by shaping. If you're good at language, if you speak Arabic really well, you learn Arabic by the shaping process. If you are a really nice, friendly person, you learn to be a really nice, friendly person through the shaping process. Everything that we are, every characteristic that we have, every ability that we have, we learn through the shaping process. Because you remember from the first day's talk, you come into the world as a blank page to be written upon by the hand of the environment or by your experiences. And the influences that come in, get written in there, they are constantly shaping you in a direction. What I'm talking about here is just, I mean, this goes on naturally whether you know it's going on or not. See, and until the 1930s or so, people didn't know this process was going on. And so human development just went wherever it went. And people would, be attributing, if their child had some characteristic, they'd say, oh, they're just born this way. Well, they weren't just born that way. They were born with a blank slate. They became that way. And because people didn't know that this learning process and shaping process was going on, and that blank slate was being written on with influences, that they thought this is just naturally how people are. And a whole lot of this was thought to be genetic behavior. Then on the baseline, what you always do is you start with small steps toward the goal. And you make sure the small steps are rewarded, because you remember I said any response that is followed by a reward will tend to increase in rate and magnitude in the future. So you want to move toward this goal, and you want the steps along the way and get to be bigger and bigger steps, because you are increasing not only in rate but in magnitude. So all learning takes place like this. You start wherever you start, and you set a goal. You go through the shaping process, which is the successive reward, the reward of successive small steps from the baseline condition toward the goal condition. And it isn't like just my chicken example, and it isn't like the child with the tantrum example. The baseline condition can be the present behavior of world society, which is really quite bad. And our goal condition can be a world society consistent with that acts and believes consistently with the will of Allah. Right? So that is also achievable through this same process. Now, I rhetorically asked the question a few minutes ago. Rhetorically mean I didn't expect an answer. I just put it out as a question. If I want my chicken to do that task, where do I start? What if I think, well, maybe since he's standing there like this with his beak right in front of the red button, maybe I'll teach him to press the red button first. Not a good idea. Because the behavior that I want to condition is actually like a chain. All behavior, really, I'll explain in more detail chains of behavior later. Everything we do is actually in a chain, although we don't think about it as a chain. It looks like just a flowing sequence, but these things are really a chain. So the chain here for the chicken is 1, stand on right leg only. 2, turn full circle. Circle to the right, hopping on its right foot only. Third step, push red button. Fourth step, have a bite of food. Fifth step, do again. So, you see what I want to do here falls into a particular sequence. And when you want to teach somebody something, you teach it in a logical sequence. If I want to teach a child, to learn the multiplication tables, I don't start by what is 9 times 7 and what is 8 times 12, things like that. I start with what is 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3. See, because we assume if you're teaching a child multiplication tables, the baseline is they don't know any. And the goal is you want them to know maybe up to 12 times 12. But you start, it's very important that these early steps be easily achieved and highly rewarded, because you want to get the process moving in a direction. If the process is not moving, if there's nothing at all happening, there's nothing to reward on the way. So you want to make the first ones, and you don't want the children to be experiencing failure, because you experience a bit of failure and then you quit trying. So you want to be sure that you make the first steps small, easily achievable, and highly rewarded, so you get the process going. And as you go along, you can make the process harder and harder, and you don't have to, and you can give less and less reward, which we'll talk about later. But for the chicken, so the first thing I want to do is have my chicken stand on its right leg only. Now, the chicken isn't just going to stand there just like this in the cage forever, right? Just as people do, move around a little bit. And if you take a move to the right, it is the way that we and chickens do it. You take your right foot off the ground a bit and move to the right. Or if you want to move to the left, you take your left foot off the ground just a little bit and you move to the left. So the thing that I didn't mention, in this cage I also have a wire hooked up to the food tray, and my chicken is hungry, by the way. This is an important part of it. You need to have a motivated subject if you want to teach anything. So it is very important, if you want to teach children, say, multiplication tables, that you just don't put them in an unhappy situation where they're resenting having to sit there. They don't like the teacher, they don't like the numbers, and they don't feel like learning multiplication. You're not going to have a very willing and highly motivated subject. So the idea is to give the children information first that will motivate them to want to learn the multiplication tables before you teach them. With a chicken, I can't give it that kind of mental motivation. So what I do is I first let the chicken go for a few days, and I weigh it every day, and I see what its average weight is every day when it can have as much as it likes to eat. And then I quit feeding the chicken until it drops down to 80% of that weight. So I have a very hungry chicken, meaning that food is a very big reward, because I'm going to reward it with food for its behavior. So now I have a very motivated chicken standing there like this. Also, a very motivated chicken is probably going to be moving around more, having a look to see if there's any food or anything in the environment. So I have this wire coming to a button that I can press, and if I press the button, the food tray pops up. The food is in little pellets, and so the chicken can just get one little food pellet about this big at a time, and then the food hopper drops back down. So it gets one bite of food for each reward. So I watch carefully, and I see when it goes to move like this, and it doesn't matter how far, right? The slightest space that gets between the chicken's left foot and the floor is a step toward, right, shaping, step toward the goal. Instead of standing with both feet on the floor, now having lifted its left foot, even if it was only this far, it gets a reward because it is a step in the direction of my goal, the first one in the chain. But maybe the first time the chicken lifts its leg this far, right? It doesn't matter how far it lifts it. Let's just say it lifts it this far. And the food hopper has it makes a noise when it pops up, so the chicken will look there and then say, "Ooh, food!" Quick grab a bite, and then the thing drops back down and it can't get to the food, but it can see the food. So then the chicken gets back and it stands there like that. Now I wait until it lifts its left leg again. Now if it lifted its left leg this much the first time, what if the second time it lifts its leg and it lifts it this far? Do I give it any food? No, you see. Because if it lifted its leg this far the first time, and this far the second time, and I gave it food, I'm actually shaping it away from my goal. I'm rewarding behavior away from my goal, which I then will expect will increase. So I wait until the chicken's leg moves higher than it did the first time. Then I reward it again. And amazingly, within like a couple of minutes, I have a chicken standing there like this. I mean, you can almost just watch. It took like 5 or 6 responses of watching the chicken do this, and all of a sudden it has learned to just stand there like that. But once it's standing there like that, it has finished the first step in the chain. So it can't lift its left leg any further than this. I mean, a chicken has a certain, just as we do, a certain level it can lift its leg to, and it lifts it to there. So what does it do next? Because it can't get any more reward from this step on the chain. So chickens, when they're standing there, don't stand there with their head absolutely fixed ahead like this. They look around just like people do. Looks to the left, gets nothing. Looks to the right. Looking to the right is a step toward making a full turn to the right. So the chicken standing there like this, looks over to the right, press the button. Here's the food thing, takes a bite of food, steps back up. May look around this way, nothing happens. Look not as far to the left, to the right, doesn't get anything. Goes like that. Food tray pops up again because it has taken another further step toward this goal. Now chickens can actually turn their head a whole 180 degrees and look straight backwards. So you finally get the chicken standing there like this with its head around further than I can turn mine, looking straight backwards. Now it can't go any further except to go like that, which it does, and then it gets some food. But by then, it is fairly likely that it is going to go ahead and turn the rest of the way, because the most efficient way, since it's already moving in that direction, is to just go ahead and keep going in the circle and get to the food, because it's already turned its head more than halfway. So it's seeing the food with its head turned from it. So it's seeing the food from over on this side, but with its head turned. And so it just finishes the full circle, hopping on its right foot, standing there, and now I press the button and the chicken gets some food. It does that again, but it doesn't get anything, you see, because it has finished the second one on the chain. So we have the chicken there now, stands on its left foot, turns a full circle, standing there, doesn't know what to do. Nothing it does gets it any food. But it has learned quite successfully by now to stand like that. Well, right there in front of its face, about this far away, is a red button against a white background on the wall. The way chickens find food, chickens are not, they don't have very good eyesight, and they basically find food by just pecking at things that stand out from the environment. And because they are not very smart, it can't tell a plastic button isn't food. It just knows there is a shape of a different color, or that looks different in the area in front of it. So it just thinks, well, I'll give it a chance. I'll just peck this and see. Pecks it, and now I don't have to press the button. Pushing that button actually pops the food tray up itself. So now the chicken has just pressed that red button, gets the food, And it's amazing to see, but then it will stand there like that for a second, and then it will hop around and press the button again, and it has learned it. Really less than 10 minutes. And you can almost see each stage happening in this learning process. Now, with human beings, of course, our learning processes are much, much more sophisticated. And they can sometimes take longer, or because you can talk to people. If this was a 5-year-old child, and I had them in a room with like a, I don't want to say an experimental chamber, but like a small room, and they were hungry and there was some candy they wanted, and I said, well, you know, if you'll stand on your right foot only, hop on your right foot at full circle to the right, push this button on the wall, you can reach down there and get a piece of candy. Then they'll just do that right away. So you can speed up the learning process a lot because human beings have a symbolic language. So you see what all the steps are, right? These steps that I have just described to you, that you start with a baseline and you plan to go through a series of small steps towards your goal, and then you realize that to get there, it is going to be a chain of behaviors, and you want to start in the logical right place in the chain, and make a chain that is in a sequence, so you are constantly progressing towards your goal, and you want to make your early stages very easy to achieve and highly rewarded, and that is all there is to learning. Now, does all that sound very reasonable? I tell you this now. It took me maybe 10 minutes to tell you this. In that 10 minutes, every single one of you here now, you may not believe it, but every single one of you now could teach a chicken in probably about the same time I did, if you did exactly what I told you. Every one of you could teach a chicken to do that same complex task in about the same amount of time. This is how powerful the tool is. It is not just powerful, it is simple. You know, when you don't know it, you can't do it. It's like a lever. It doesn't take long to learn to use a lever. You know, until you know how to use a lever, you can't do a certain task. Somebody takes you up, shows you, look, you just get a pole and a rock or something for a fulcrum, put this pole under the thing you want to lift, push down on the other end, and the longer it is on the part from the fulcrum that you are pushing on, the easier it will go, and you can do it right away. And the same kind of thing is true with this law of learning. That everyone in here is probably now capable of teaching that chicken to do that complex task in 10 minutes or so, where before you heard this knowledge, you very well may not have been able to teach the chicken that task in a year, because there's just no way to do it. So this is how important learning is, right? Plus, it is a shaping process. This is not all there is to learning, but to know this is very, very important in understanding all the other things you'll hear in the learning process, because absolutely all of learning takes place this way. But there are many different ways to apply this way. Are there any questions about any of this part? Yes?
Say if you check the behavior of the child, say for instance, and you put a sequence that you want them to go through, and say they skip a sequence, one of the sequences, and they go into, one of the things that they have to do, and they go into something else, would you be rewarding the behavior then?
To go to something else.
Like for example here, the chicken thing. If that chicken had actually pressed the red button instead of doing the big circle, would you be rewarding that?
Oh no, no way in the world.
So you wanted to do exactly what you wanted to do for you to reward it.
Well, if it didn't, it wouldn't be doing the task I designed for it to do. See, it isn't that I wanted to eat. Why would it bother to press the red button after it ate? So I would have no way in there to teach it to press the red button.
Professor Muhammad,
Yes.
this applies to a child, and probably if you do it well, it will work. But will that will work in the same manner if you apply to an older child, say a teenager, and then a young adult?
Well, what I am doing in here is I am shaping your behavior. You know, 10 minutes ago you didn't know how to teach a chicken this. Now you do, you see. And hopefully learning that knowledge was rewarding. And so, and hopefully motivating. So some of the other stuff I'm going to tell you, which like yesterday will be a little bit technical, you know, maybe you'll be more interested in learning it. And so through the process of today's course, I will teach you more and more. I will try and essentially, if I want to use the word, you came in here with whatever knowledge you have about the laws of learning, right? Different people have different amount. My goal is to teach you as much as I can today about the laws of learning. So I will go through this process today. It works on human beings. It works on adults. By the way, interestingly, these same laws of learning work all the way. Some people want to say, well, yeah, they work on animals, but does the same thing work on humans? Not only does it work on humans, it works on animals. Remember yesterday I said what the simplest of the one-celled organisms is? What was it? An amoeba, right? It works all the way down to an amoeba. Say, for instance, you take an amoeba and you put it on in a glass slide, and you have some food that the amoeba would want, and there is a path. The slide is made so there are some liquid paths, and the amoeba has to follow a liquid path. And it follows a liquid path toward the food, which it can perceive, but along that path there is maybe some acid which is unpleasant to it and affects its cellular wall, and it doesn't like that. So you do that a few times, and it may try that direct path a few times, and then it learns, no, and then there's another path that is a longer path, but there's no unpleasant thing on it. So it will learn to go on the path where there is nothing that will harm it. So all the way down to an amoeba, the same kind of learning can take place. Yes?
I suppose this is going to be quite later, but first and foremost, children are not chickens. Right?
Children are what?
Are not chickens.
Yeah.
But when you do this experiment, it is an experiment. Means it is in a very controlled situation. You put the chicken in a very controlled situation, and you can control it. But well, in reality, kids or humans, we don't control a lot of things in the lab, in a box. So I suppose that let's make it more complicated. But I suppose you're going to show us later how you deal with it.
Yes, but you have actually brought up an extremely important point. Back in the 1960s, when behavioral psychology or operant learning theory was at its high point, the young behavioral psychologists at the time believed they were like these knights on white horses who were going to come with this tool. It was this really powerful tool and transform society into some wonderful place. But what they found out was, when you have somebody in a controlled therapeutic environment, like your office or in a mental hospital or something like that, or in a prison, you can get any behavior you want because you have control over the whole environment. But when the people leave that environment, what they have learned disappears. And so that was a big problem with that. Basically only the word, technically the word is contingencies. Contingencies means things that depend on something else. So when the contingencies of the experimental or therapeutic environment are not there, the behavior is not there. And so people considered this a major drawback to the use of this technology for altering behavior in the natural environment. But there was an answer to it. Remember when I drew this yesterday or last week? So this is the blank page that is going to be written on by the environment. I'll say it just because it happens to be the case, but I don't say it to be immodest. Behaviorism, before, you remember I added this one here, which is the inner speech. Before I developed this, which is called a learning-based personality theory, this was all that behaviorism looked at, behavioral psychology looked at. And they considered what goes on in here to be a black box that you don't even hypothesize about, because it is impossible to know what is going on in someone's mind. So you can see better to draw it like this. Response followed by some stimulus, either a reward or a punishment, plus or negative. And you can see what the response is, and you can see what the reward is, and you can see the effect on the behavior. And the behaviorists were only looking at these two. The reason I think they started only looking at these two was because the early experiments are with animals, and animals didn't have inner speech. So when they started working with human beings, they said, well, this is the way we do it. Human beings are just the same as animals. Yes, we know human beings think, but we don't know what's going on in the thinking blocks. So this is the black box. We don't look in here. Actually, used to use this term. Specifically, that was an area you stay out of. But then, after being in this field for some years and seeing that problem that you raised be so detrimental to the success of the use of this tool, that many behaviorists were leaving there. So, well, what good is having a powerful tool to change behavior if you can only change it in an experimental or a therapeutic environment, that you send people out into the natural environment and you can't take the contingencies with you, so the behavior breaks down. So what I said was, actually, we do know something about what happens in this black box. I hypothesized this actually, but what I hypothesized was that when we think to ourselves, not just with words, but feelings or inspiration or anything, that this goes into our perception just like anything else, because I know with myself, if I think some words, it's no different to me than someone hearing them from someone else. It's like I just hear them. So, and they have to go into my perception. Everything that goes into perception writes a message in here. And so I say, how is this any different from the social environment? And because every single thing that goes in here its effect is determined by what I'll explain in a few minutes are the laws of operant learning about reward and punishment, that the mental processes work in exactly the same way as the social processes. But they have the benefit of these social processes were only being able to be applied contingently in the experimental or the therapeutic environment. So you leave the experimental or therapeutic environment, and the person who was inputting these social influences, they're gone. So they're no longer having effect. But if you can get the person to be themselves applying the same kind of influences, that the positive influences for change under the same conditions as the external person was doing, then wherever you go, you take the same contingencies with you. So it ended up being called behavior modification in the natural environment, and now is really called cognitive psychology. So all of what's the main area in psychology today is really cognitive psychology. And aside from all the somewhat less than valid areas that are part of psychology, I don't want to say all of cognitive psychology is true, but certainly the part of cognitive psychology that involves this kind of learning process certainly is accurate. Some others may be accurate, some others may not. But there are a lot of false notions in cognitive psychology. But it did allow a very effective way to take this outside of the therapeutic environment, which is why when we ran this as an experiment in Odney School last year, not as an experiment, actually as a model, because we had already done it as an experiment. I had already done it as an experiment many years ago. We find that what we teach the children in the classroom doesn't just stay in the classroom, but they take it home. And 100% of the parents surveyed said that they saw positive changes in their kids in the home that came from the learning experiences based on this type of learning theory in the classroom at school. So they took the contingencies with them in their brains and applied them through their inner speech at home. So that is the answer and solution to that very important problem that virtually destroyed the notion of helping solve some human problems through the use of operant learning theory. Pardon? Yeah, well, I mean, you notice I use the word reward, right? There's really no difference between the word reward and reinforcement. Reinforcement is the technical word used in operant learning theory to refer to reward. But because many people have not heard the word reinforcement and everybody knows what reward means, I now use the word reward. But if I sometimes I will switch back and forth so you can remember both. Now, I'm going to write two words on the board which essentially are the totality of the laws of learning. All of the laws of learning are about the application of reward or punishment. basically in this form as I drew before. You have a response. A response can be a physical action, can be a word, it can even be a thought. But if it is a thought, you have to deal with it with inner speech because somebody outside doesn't know for sure what your thought is. And every response is followed by something. It is impossible to have a response that is not followed by anything. So every response is followed by some stimulus. And that stimulus has only two possibilities. It can be positive or it can be negative. And if you follow a response by a stimulus that is positive, we call that reinforcement or reward, and it will tend to increase in the future the rate and magnitude of the response. If the stimulus following the response is a negative one, it will tend in the future to decrease the rate and magnitude of that response. So reward increases the rate of the response, punishment decreases the rate of the response. So far, all extremely simple. Later on, I will tell you why reward is really good and punishment is really bad. But I will just say this to give you some hint of where I'm going with punishment. I will say it is impossible to punish a child without harming a child. I'm not going to say later never punish, but I'm saying it is impossible to use punishment without harming the child, although there are cases where the harm is justified. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to ask you, can it be that it is, when you look at behaviorism, for example, or a neutral stimulus, can it be that the response is neutral? There is no positive or negative?
Just a little lesson on elementary number theory, mathematics. So, elementary number theory, we can have positive numbers or we can have negative numbers. In between, we have 0, which would be the equivalent of neutral. A point on a number line, which is represented by a number, has no dimension. It is a theoretical construct. So the point of 0 and neutral is 0 in size. There is actually no such thing as neutral. Every single stimulus will be, well, I mean, some could be partially positive and partially negative, but there is no such thing as a neutral stimulus.
What if, like, say, with conditioning, for example, exposing someone to a stimulus that they don't respond to in either way, would that be neutral then?
No, it's not neutral. It just means they don't respond in either way.
Would that be neutral?
No,
It's not positive, it's not negative.
you can't say that
Why not?
because it is having some effect greater than 0.
You can't measure.
There are cases when you cannot measure the effect, but you are always having an effect. If you remember yesterday when I was talking about what effect the hearing about this proof of the existence of God would have on different people, and I drew the normal curve. There's going to be those atheists down there. They are not going to believe in God any more than they did before, but they will be shifted somewhat in their perception as to whether or not there exists any evidence that God exists. So they may still go around and talk just like they are atheists, like they have always been. And you could say, well, the effect on them was 0, but it was not 0. You just don't get to see it. So theoretically, right, under that I should leave it up there, you know, that thing like this where you have the inputs coming in. Every single input that comes in has some effect greater than 0. That doesn't mean that we notice all of them. I mean, right now, you know, from the room, I am having billions and billions of different little bits of light energy coming in, telling me all sorts of information from around the room. Every single one of them has some impact greater than 0 here. But most of them I am not noticing. So technically they are not neutral. Because it is impossible to be neutral because of this point I made here, which is a reality of the way things work. That actual points, such as neutral, do not actually exist in dimension. They exist only as an idea. So when we have reward and punishment as the totality of the laws of learning, it turns out that there are actually 2 ways to apply reward and 2 ways to apply punishment. And by the way, you know, I say there are positive and negative stimulus, but you cannot know whether a stimulus is positive or negative until you see its effect on the response. Most people don't like pain, but there is a group of people called masochists who seem to like pain. So most people, if they did a response and you hit them with a stick, they'll quit doing that. If you are a masochist, maybe they do a response and you hit them with a stick and they'll do it more often because they like being hit. See, so the only way you can know whether a stimulus is positive or negative, there is actually no such thing as a positive or negative stimulus. It depends on the circumstances of the individual. At least with human beings. With animals, it's certainly not nearly so the case. Anyway, so assuming that there are 2 kinds of stimulus, positive or negative, although we don't know what their effect will be until after we see it, there are 2 things you can do with a positive or negative. You can give it or you can take it.